Our two speakers today, the first speaker of today is Moulie Vidas. Professor Moulie Vidas is an associate professor of religion and in the program of Judaic Studies at Princeton University. His research focuses on classical Jewish texts, especially the Talmuds, in the context of late antiquity. Moulie is the author of Tradition and the Formation of the Talmud from 2014, and recently the Rise of Talmud from 2025, which is our topic of discussion today. Vidas also co-edited the volume Late Ancient Knowing, Explorations in Intellectual History from 2015, and is a faculty member in the Princeton's program of the Ancient World. Responding today to Moulie's new book is Professor Alyssa Gray. Alyssa Gray is the Emily S. and Rabbi Bernard H. Melman Chair in Rabbinics and Professor of Codes and Responsa Literature at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. Her scholarship examines the development of Talmudic literature, the history of Jewish law, and literary studies of post-Talmudic legal writings. Gray is the author of Charity in Rabbinic Judaism, Atonement, Rewards and Righteousness from 2019, and A Talmud in Exile, the influence of Yerushalmi Avodah Zarah on the formation of Bavli Avodah Zarah from 2005. So the way we're going to proceed today, Moulie is going to kick us off with a presentation about his book, followed by Alyssa's respond, and hopefully a rich dialogue with all of us. Thank you so much.
Doesn't show. Okay. Hi, everybody. I want to start by thanking first DeGolan for inviting me. And indeed, I don't know how many of you, some of you probably know Erez's work. One of the passages that Erez illuminates so well is a passage where the rabbis express joy upon seeing the destroyed temple. And it's if you're looking for work that in a sophisticated way might give you some hope in a time of not a lot of hope, I think that Erez's work is that sort. So I'm very grateful to Erez for today and for the program in the Center for Jewish Studies at Fordham and to its director, Professor Tetter, whom I've known for many years. And I want to thank in advance, so I still don't know what you might say to my colleague, Professor Gray, who is a scholar of the Talmud, among other things, the Talmud Yerushalmi, that I really respect and whose work influenced my own. So it's really a pleasure to be here. So what I thought I'd do, I don't want to talk for like hours and hours, obviously. I wanted to give you a sense of what were the main problems that I tried to solve in this book. What was the main motivation for it, and give you a taste of like some concrete examples, because otherwise it gets so abstract and we can get lost. So by Rise of Talmud, I mean a very specific intellectual process in intellectual Jewish history that takes place in the 3rd century CE. The process is the rise of commentary, not on scripture, which happened a century or a century and a half before, but rather the rise of commentary on rabbinic teachings. So the rabbis had previously already developed a very sophisticated system of interpretation of scripture that we call midrash. The camera is here. I see. Thank you. The absent author could be good. They developed a system called midrash, but in the 3rd century, they also turned to a systematic and detailed interpretation of rabbinic teachings. I will pause and say that in the Talmuds themselves, the word Talmud doesn't necessarily refer to that. It comes later to refer to commentary on rabbinic teaching. I'm happy to speak about that problem of terminology in the Q&A, but I will say that the same problem actually exists for Midrash. Midrash also is a term that appears in the ancient sources and isn't necessarily confined to the interpretation of scripture. So these two terms come to mean interpretation of scripture for Midrash and interpretation of rabbinic teachings for Talmud, but they don't originally mean that. So I just wanted to flag that in case somebody's like, wait, how do you? Yeah. So I was looking at this process, and the reason that I was looking at this process is because I wanted to understand what is the intellectual contribution of the phenomenon we now call Talmud in Jewish history. What was the distinctive thing that it offered? Because by the time that this phenomenon occurs, by the time that we have Talmud, the sages of the previous era, the sages of the 1st and 2nd century, already set out a lot of what we now associate with the word Talmud. So the full system of Jewish law is already pretty developed, right? The ideology of disagreement that Professor Tedder talked about, right? Much of it is already in existence. As I mentioned, the interpretation of scripture. So what is it that the Talmuds add? And one way to think about it is the distinction between the two periods that in traditional Jewish historiography, we call the Tannaitic period and the Amoraic period. So the Tannaitic period is the first period. When it begins, actually, there's a lot of disagreement in Jewish history about that. But the line between them is the line of a particular textual event, the composition of the Mishnah. So as the traditional story goes, and you could take issues with this traditional history, I'm just giving you the traditional history. History goes is that when Rabbi Judah the Patriarch, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi in Hebrew, compiles the Mishnah in the early 3rd century CE, the Tannaitic period concludes and the Amoraic period begins. And what makes that Amoraic period in part distinctive, I think its definitive actually feature, is that it is a period of commentary on rabbinic teachings, which didn't happen before. In fact, there are good reasons to think that the name Amoraic, Amorah, which means interpreter in most of the earlier instances in which it appears, is the reason that it's called Amoraic period, right? It's the period of the interpreters. Now, to examine that shift, right, I wanted to not look at the Babylonian Talmud, but at the text that we now call the Palestinian Talmud or Talmud Yerushalmi. For those of you who don't know, and I'm trying to I understand there are probably people of diverse background. There are probably people here who know these texts by heart and have written extensively about them. There are also people who've never heard about them. So just a 30-second crash course. The Babylonian Talmud is the text that is usually known by the name Talmud. It is much longer than the Talmud Yerushalmi, and it is the reason that it is known, that it is better known, is that since the Middle Ages on, it has become the center of the traditional Jewish curriculum and the highest authority for traditional Jewish law. That is the Babylonian Talmud. It has a somewhat less popular, actually a lot less popular, older brother or sister. I don't know the gender, or maybe they're beyond that, right? As an older sibling, a much less popular older sibling known as the Talmud Yerushalmi. Talmud Yerushalmi is, in part because of this relative neglect, because it wasn't as popular, is actually pretty difficult to parse because there isn't a continuous interpretive tradition, because there are actually very few manuscripts, right? But it has this distinction of being the first. And by looking at the Yerushalmi, my goal was to avoid some of the narratives about what is Talmud, about how this Talmud develops, that assume already the development of the later Talmud, right? Because what would happen? What would happen is, for example, that people would say, okay, what is the difference between the Tannaitic and Amoraic period? You see this in works, for example, by very important scholars like Weiss or Halivni, right? What is the difference? The difference is that dialectic, this is connected to our emphasis on the disagreement, dialectic, this kind of like back and forth, that becomes the core of the tradition, right? But the issue is that the Palestinian Talmud or Talmud Yerushalmi actually does that much less and does it differently. So the result is a kind of what scholars call sometimes a teleological narrative, a narrative that is defined by its end And the Yerushalmi usually plays the role of the kind of less attractive, less interesting, like less developed, not mature Talmud, right? So the question was, what happens when we just focus on the Yerushalmi and tell the story from there? And things that's central to me is, again, that process of rise of commentary and review. Now, earlier scholarly accounts of that rise of commentary on rabbinic teachings understood it largely as an expansion of rabbinic commentary on scripture. The thesis was something like this, and I'm a bit simplifying because it's a short talk, but I'm happy to go into more detail. The thesis was something like that. What Midrash, the interpretation of scripture, does with scripture, that is that Talmud does the same with the rabbinic teachings. It uses some of the same methods, the same practices that with which the rabbis read scripture, they use to read rabbinic teachings. And that is completely true to some degree. But it misses what was distinctive about it. It misses what difference it made. And that was the focus of my book. So the first item of my agenda was to check what is distinctive of Amoraic commentary and rabbinic teachings, how it is different from scripture. And I found several ways, and I'll share with you more, one a little bit more in detail, and one I will not talk about in detail at all, but now just to name both of them. Whereas the sages understood scripture, generally speaking, to be representing a singular divine voice. So it doesn't matter if a verse is in Deuteronomy or in Jeremiah or in the Book of Kings, right? It is all God's voice speaking, right? They understood rabbinic teachings as the different voices, hence the disagreement, different voices, different opinions of particular human beings, individual human beings, and that opened a whole different range of interpretations, as I hope to show in a bit more detail in a few minutes, right? So the first difference between rabbinic study of scripture and rabbinic study of rabbinic teachings is this idea of the individual opinion, the individual stage, as a key to interpreting the text, and we'll see that that becomes very, very important. The second aspect that I will not talk so much about today was the construction of rabbinic teachings as imperfect texts. What do I mean by that? When you look at the rabbis, and this is actually another aspect of the book, is to look at the rabbis in comparison with other textual scholars from antiquity. When you look at the rabbis in comparison with other textual scholars from antiquity, for example, Christians writing on the Christian scripture, or Greeks and Romans writing on their own classical texts, one of the things that is striking about their commentary on scripture is that they don't think of the text as a possibly corrupt or erroneous text, right? So Christians, when they study scripture, they all the time make emendations, or they compare different versions of the text. Some of the greatest textual scholarship from antiquity, Jerome, Eusebius, Origen, that's what they do. The rabbis don't ever amend the text of scripture. They very, very rarely compare versions of scripture. We have maybe 6 or 7 passages in this entire wide corpus. But when they look at rabbinic teachings, they do precisely all of that. There are dozens of emendations. There are comparisons of different versions, right? So in both of these ways, these are the two ways. So one is the one I just talked about, imperfect text. The other is this emphasis on individual opinions. Both of these ways, this commentary diverged from rabbinic teachings. This commentary on rabbinic teachings rather diverged from commentary on scripture. But, and here we get to the second argument, which actually made this book a lot more interesting to write. What I discovered as I was writing this was that it is not the case that these differences between how the sages interpret scripture on the one hand and how they interpret rabbinic teachings on the one hand, it is not the case that these differences owe to preconceptions that the sages had of scripture and of rabbinic teachings. Meaning, it's not that, oh, of course, now we're interpreting these new texts, rabbinic teachings, and we think of them differently, so we're going to interpret them differently than scripture. That's not what happened. What happened, in my opinion, and I wrote many, many pages to show that, is that in interpreting rabbinic teachings, the sages came to have a completely different view of rabbinic teachings than earlier views of rabbinic teachings themselves. Meaning, as they were writing this commentary, they came up with a new conception of the tradition that we don't find in Tannaitic texts, in texts of the previous era. Okay, so what I want to do, so that was just my general introduction of the rise of Talmud. What I want to do with you now is look at a little bit more closely at the argument in two parts. I'm not going to get to the fourth part because I'm eager to hear what Professor Gray has to say. So I'll just with these 2 and 3, we'll go over them again with relatively quickly of what I call the individuation of Torah, meaning exactly that process by which the rabbis come to think of the rabbinic tradition in individuated terms, in terms of the individuals to whom the teachings are attributed. And we'll look at some pervasive Talmudic, one example at least, of pervasive Talmudic terminology and patterns of commentary that are associated with that. So many rabbinic teachings and all rabbinic texts present attributions, right? So this is kind of a normal example. Rabban Gamaliel says, each day a person must pray the 18 benedictions. Rabbi Joshua says a summary of the 18, right? In part, notice how the attribution allows for the disagreement. We'll talk about it a bit. I'll try to give some remarks at the end of this. What is the law of fulfilling the 4-cup drinking requirement on Passover with cooked wine? Rabbi Jonah says one may fulfill it with cooked wine. This one is especially interesting. Keep it in mind. I promise it is more interesting than it seems right now, and that it will come to mean something. But to give an example that maybe is more on the face of it more interesting, Rabbi Hanina ben Andre said in the name of Rabbi Samuel ben Soter, angels have no joints in their knees, right? So these are some regular examples of attributions. And the question that arises when you see these attributions is, what do these attributions mean? Our intuition as modern people is to read the teaching in light of the attribution, right? So when we see that Rabban Gamliel has this opinion, Rabbi Joshua has this opinion, we ask questions like, what is it about Rabban Gamliel's worldview that makes him differ from Rabbi Joshua? What is it about his life? What is it about his, how is this connected to other teachings that he might have? We basically want to interpret the teaching in light of the attribution, just like when we, look at a novel by Toni Morrison or a philosophical book by Friedrich Nietzsche, we ask these questions. What is it about Morrison's worldview or stylistic tendencies that have made her do the choices that she makes? Modern scholarship for the past 30 years has argued that this kind of questions that I've shared with you now of how the attribution relates to the teaching, they are essentially misguided. And they are misguided for 2 reasons. The first problem is the reliability of attributions. So the idea here is that, and these are the scholars who problematized it, the idea here is that when you see here Rabban Gamaliel says or Rabbi Joshua says, we actually don't really know that these rabbis actually said these things. And more troublingly, many rabbinic texts give contradictory attributions. So what is attributed to Rabban Gamaliel in one text is attributed to Rabbi Joshua in another text, or maybe appears anonymously in a third text, right? So how do we know that it is these rabbis who said these things? This is a problem of rabbinic biography. So that was the first problem of dealing with these attributions. Another problem was that scholars argued, and Martin Jaffe is, I think, the most important study here, that it uncritically applies modern assumptions about authorship to ancient texts. So what Jaffe argues, right, is the Western conception of authorship. So what I said with the Morrison or Nietzsche, right? When you see it on the cover of a book, right, that it says Toni Morrison or Friedrich Nietzsche, it assumes a certain concept of authorship that is distinctively modern and Western, right? And there are good reasons to think that, right? So for example, until the modern period, there wasn't copyright law, right? Also think about it, before the printing press, authors had actually much less control of the text that they were disseminating, because there wasn't just like one text that, they press send and like thousands of copies are printed. Every copy had to be copied by a scribe, and scribe, we know, change things as they go, right? And so who is authoring the text? Is it the scribe or the author, right? So Jaffe argued, right, that our notion of authorship is distinctively modern and Western, and that the rabbis, in fact, didn't think that way, that they thought of rabbinic teachings as drawn from a general tradition, and that therefore an attribution to a sage indicates he is merely the latest one to pass it on. At best, it's transmitter, not its creator or author. And now, many people disagree with this statement by Jaffe. They don't necessarily think that every statement in rabbinic literature is a statement of tradition rather than originality. There is disagreement on that. But the article pretty much cemented the consensus of not talking about authorship in the context of rabbinic literature. Now, when Jaffe, and just to explain what troubled me about this, because I agree with a lot of it, but here's where I started to question it. One of the theorists that Jaffe uses most heavily to argue that this modern notion of authorship is modern and Western is Michel Foucault in an essay called "What is an Author?" It's a very influential essay in modern literary theory. But when you actually open "What is an Author?", one of the things that to me at least was striking is that Foucault argues that this so-called modern notion of authorship originated in Christianity in 5th century, late 4th century Palestine, in Jerome's De Viris Illustribus, right? Now, this was really interesting to me because Jaffe and other people used Foucault to say, oh, no, you can't apply modern notion of authorship to the rabbis because this is a modern notion. But then Foucault says, wait, this modern notion directly derives from people who worked alongside the rabbis, actually knew rabbis. We know Jerome knows rabbis, and in the same place and time, right? So there's a problem here with this idea of the modernity of the notion, right? And in fact, Foucault's essay also helps us solve this other problem that I mentioned earlier, the problem of the reliability of attributions. He writes, Hermes Trismegistus did not exist, nor did Hippocrates in the sense that Balzac existed, but the fact that several texts have been placed under the same name indicates that there has been established among them a relationship of homogeneity, filiation, authentication of some texts by others, etc. What Foucault means is that regardless of whether an attribution of the text is correct, regardless of whether Rabban Gamaliel actually says that, the fact that a text says something like that, it attributes it, and as we will see in the Talmud makes something of that attribution. It uses that as an information to an interpretation. That itself is an important construct that we must pay attention to because it's a cultural phenomenon on its own, right? It's a key to how these people conceived of a text, much like for us, right? If it might be, I don't know, maybe Morrison didn't write the novels that she wrote, but at this point, Toni Morrison is a phenomenon, right? And she is studied as an author in English classes, right? And that is an important thing of the reception of these texts on its own right. And so what I found in, or at least argued in the book, is that precisely in this Amoraic period, what we see is a new attention to individuals as the creators of texts, and therefore a new perception of rabbinic teaching as stemming from the worldview of these texts. And I want to show you, okay, so let me just maybe summarize. So Amoraic scholars, summarize that part of the book. Amoraic scholars developed a series of interpretive practices that read rabbinic teachings in light of the attribution to individual sages. This stands in contrast with Midrash. The sages generally read scripture as the expression of a singular divine voice, as I mentioned. It also stands in contrast with the Tannaitic compilations, meaning the earlier rabbinic texts, which generally negotiate rabbinic teachings as positions that transcend individual contributions. Okay, and I want to give you one detailed example, which is the term da'at. The term da'at is the same term for knowledge that appears in the book of Genesis to describe the tree of knowledge. That's why I have the illustration there. Talmud is a field barren in visual representation. So every time we can find something, we use it. And da'at means knowledge, of course, in in the Bible, hence the tree of knowledge. But in rabbinic literature, it comes to have a different sense, already in the Tannaitic compilations, in those pre-Talmudic compilations. In the Talmudic compilation, it means a variety of mental properties. So, for example, it can mean consent. So if someone rented a house and it collapsed, the owner is obligated to provide the renter with a new house. One may neither reduce the number, this is a very New York City, by the way, one may neither reduce the number of windows nor increase them, except with the consent, da'at, of both, right? So da'at here means something like, or not sorry, it means consent, right? Or da'at can mean for temperament, de'ot, easily angered, easily pleased, right? And it goes on and on, right? So da'at here means like temperament or mood, right? Habitual mood in the sense of characteristic mood. Or it can mean taste or preference. Just as there are preferences concerning food, so there are preferences concerning women, says Rabbi Meir. I didn't bring the rest of the thing because it's kind of misogynistic. The problem with the Talmud is that very often you want to bring an example, and it turns out to be an awfully misogynistic example. And I want to acknowledge that these texts have that, but I don't want to give them the pleasure of dwelling too much on that. So my point about this is that this word da'at, which in the Bible means knowledge, comes to mean something like preference, consent, temperament, taste, and there are many, many, many examples. Now, let's do a little bit of interaction. Somebody who speaks modern Hebrew here, what is the most common meaning of the word da'ah today in modern Hebrew? Anybody wants to? When somebody has a da'ah or
Opinion.
Opinion, absolutely, yes. So opinion is what this word comes to mean in modern Hebrew. It doesn't ever mean that in the Tannaitic text. Now, earlier when Professor Tedder was introducing our series, she was saying rabbis have conflicting opinion, and that's a it's true. That's a very central feature of rabbinic literature from the Talmud on. But the word opinion, da'ah, as we know today, never applies to rabbinic teachings before the Talmud. I think the reason for it is because notice that all these things are a little bit arbitrary, right? They are kind of like whatever the person wants, right? Do I want windows in my house or not? Am I easily angered or am I easily pleased? They are like stuff about the individuals, and I think Tannaitic compilations were hesitant to use this kind of word that implies this kind of individuality to the rabbinic teachings themselves. Rabbinic teachings, Tannaitic compilations generally use the word words to refer to the words of the rabbis, not opinion. In Tannaitic compilations, that or da'ah never refers to the stage opinions, but rather words appears. In the Talmud, that is the commonplace way to refer to rabbinic opinions throughout in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of passages, right? You can even see how certain phrases simply replace the words with the word opinion. So when you have the phrase, I prefer the position of Rabbi X, right? It becomes from I prefer the words of Rabbi Simeon to I prefer the opinion of Elazar ben Rabbi Simeon, right? So the idea of the opinion replaces the idea of the words. Now, this is not just a kind of a neutral phrase. It implied that the opinion or position in question did not necessarily come from tradition, but actually represented the individual reasoning of the particular sage. Just to give you an example of how we see that. So this is from Tractat Megillah, and the issue is a bit trivial, as it often is, I must say, in the Talmud, but bear with me, right? If the new moon of the month of Adar falls on Sabbath Eve, when do they read the Shekalim portion of the Torah? That's the question. Rabbi Zeira says they read it in the previous Sabbath Eve, and Rabbi Hila says that Rabbi Abau said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, said they read it in the next one. Rabbi Zeira was staring at him. So Rabbi Zeira is staring at Rabbi Hila. Now, again, maybe just to make it a little bit more interactive, don't look at the last paragraph. What is the main formal teaching difference between the teaching of Rabbi Zeira and the difference of Rabbi Hila? Formally, without relation to the context. Anybody wants to? I don't know if yeah, sure.
No footnotes.
No footnotes, exactly. Meaning Rabbi Hila quotes a rabbi who quotes a rabbi. He has a long tradition he's relying on, whereas Rabbi Zira just stated what he thought, right? Now, staring in the Talmud Yerushalmi is a form of disapproval. When somebody stares at somebody, right, it's a form that they disapprove of what they're saying. So Rabbi Zira is staring at Rabbi Hila, and then Rabbi Hila answers angrily, "Why are you staring at me? I say from tradition and you say from opinion, and you are staring at me, right? Like what are you doing, right? I have this like long lineage that goes back to the most prominent sage of the Yerushalmi, Rabbi Yochanan. You're just stating whatever is on your mind, and you're disapproving of me." So the point here is that using this term de'ah carried a certain sense of what these teachings, what the origin of these teachings. That is employed in a lot of frequently occurring phrases that play a major structural role in the Talmud. So Rabbi kedate, al date de Rabbi. And I'm going to use just the middle one. I'm going to give you just one example, and then I'll conclude. Sorry, the first one, and then I'll conclude. Rabbi named kedate. Rabbi so-and-so said this according to his own opinion. Throughout the Talmud, the way that this kind of argument is used is to connect between two teachings by the same sage and argue that the similarity between them shows us that they show a certain preference, a certain taste, a certain inclination, or a certain opinion or reasoning, right? Again, is going back to what da'at means, right? So the Talmud is saying the fact that we can identify a footprint here, right, shows us that this belongs to the individuality of the sage itself. And we have about 100 unique cases like that in the Yerushalmi. Now, most of them are about concepts. So most of them show that the same concept is operating in two different teachings of the rabbi. I could give you such examples, but because it's the more normal example, let's skip it and move to a more juicy example. And it has to do with that teaching by Rabbi Jonah that I mentioned earlier. So what is the law on fulfilling the 4-cup drinking requirement on Passover night with cooked wine? Rabbi Jonah said, one may fulfill it with cooked wine. Now, cooked wine, for those of you who never had cooked wine, which I never had, is weaker, right? It's less alcoholic. And this is what the Talmud comments on Rabbi Jonah's teaching. Rabbi Jonah taught this according to his opinion, keda'ate. For Rabbi Jonah once drank the 4 cups of Passover night, and he had his head wrapped until Pentecost, right? And the argument here is Rabbi Jonah couldn't hold his liquor, right? He had a huge hangover, like several weeks worth of hangover, right? And therefore, he's the one who taught that one may fulfill this with drinking. Now, I want to emphasize the Talmud doesn't say this to reject Rabbi Jonah's teaching. One of the remarkable things of the shift that I'm talking about is that even though rabbinic teachings are humanized and individuated in this way, they are not rejected. In fact, that becomes part of the tradition and allows you to do new things with them. So that is the example I wanted to give. And I'll conclude by A, talking about the conclusion of the book, right? What the book concludes, and B, tying it back to the question of disagreement. So my goals in the book, as I mentioned, were recognizing the first Talmud on its own term, recognizing the Yerushalmi on its own term, centering the rise of a Moreh commentary on rabbinic teachings as a pivotal moment in Jewish intellectual history. So understanding that shift towards interpreting rabbinic teachings had a major impact both on the way the Torah was studied, the practices and scholarly practices of Torah study, but also on what was Torah, the conception of Torah. It gives us a much more complex view of rabbinic hermeneutics because the assumption, for example, that rabbis don't have the concept of authorship or the assumption that they never practice emendation is complicated by this way. And it gives us a much more solid and nuanced foundation from which to place rabbinic conversations with other traditions of textual scholarship. And I think, interestingly, both ancient but also modern. And I can elaborate on that in the Q&A if people are interested. And I'll close with what do I think it tells us about disagreement, given the series that this talk is in. So it is true that the Talmud has become an icon of disagreement, and that's fair. From the earliest layers of rabbinic literature as we know them, until crown and the jewel, as it were, the jewel and the crown, rather, the Babylonian Talmud. There are statements that celebrate disagreements. Disagreement is a major form. But what is specifically for the process that I am talking about? What is this? What does it do to disagreement? I think I want to talk about two things. I think the first thing was the this humanization or individuation that I mentioned, but also the imperfection of these rabbinic texts allows disagreeing with those texts in a different way, right? Which you cannot really do with scripture. It is true that to some degree, rabbinic teachings become precedents that are binding, but never really in the same way that scripture is. And there's a much freer range, and we can talk about that because of these perception of individuation and imperfection. So for example, one of the things that the Talmud does a lot with the Mishnah, the text that it supposedly comments on, is to say, okay, yeah, that's a Mishnah, but here's like 9 other traditions that disagree with it, right? And those are just as worthy of studying, right? And the second way is that the rabbinic corpus becomes, even more than it was in the Tannaitic period, a corpus of disputing opinions. And I think that one of the interesting things that to me at least, was a discovery in the book was, so the Talmud very often has these ideas of a contradiction between teachings, either of the same sage or of a different sage. But very often, the contradiction is not really a contradiction. It's really a contradiction only if you're really looking for a contradiction, right? And so this is in the 3rd chapter of this book. What I show is that the reasoning for that is because they want to create the rabbinic corpus as a sort of a library with like 1,000 different opinions, right? That can fruitfully and generatively be put in disagreement, right? But because it's boring to say, oh yeah, you can do either one, right? Because part of disagreement, yes, the disagreement is civil, but the disagreement is real. When the disagreement is kind of this like, oh yeah, you can do either one, right? You can go each way. That's not a real disagreement. And I think that those are the ways that I can consider it from the perspective of this book. And I now will see to Alyssa. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor DeGolan, for inviting me to participate in this conversation about Moulie's fascinating new book, The Rise of Talmud. And thank you, Professor Vidas, for your willingness to engage in this conversation with me. The Rise of Talmud, without the definite article before Talmud, is a carefully chosen title. This book is not about the Talmud Yerushalmi per se. It is not an intellectual history of the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi is used as the source of the book's comprehensive data sets, both to give that compilation its due and to, quote, center the rise of textual scholarship and rabbinic teachings as a pivotal development in Jewish intellectual history. Talmud in the book's title refers to what Vidas calls the rabbinic study of rabbinic teachings. The book is a set of discrete granular studies that Vidas argues all point the reader toward the same conclusion. The Amoraic scholars of the land of Israel were intellectual innovators to whom, unlike the Tannaitic scholars, texts produced by teachers were worthy of study and commentary. Amoraic scholars were interested in how sages' traditions reflected their individuality, and they were interested in sages' individual intellectual profiles. This distinguishes Amoraic from Tannaitic scholars who were interested in traditions in the halakha, but who did not make the study of scholars' own words the focus of their studies. Vidas's central finding about the Amoraic scholars is a scarlet thread that connects the book's 2 parts. The first part is a set of studies that explore selected Amoraic interpretive practices that assume that rabbinic teachings were shaped by individual sages and reflect their individuality. The second part consists of studies of the Amoraic sages' engagement with textual issues. These studies show that they saw these teachings as fragmentary, imperfect, and incomplete, which Vidas colorfully refers to as rabbinic tradition reflected through 100 shards of glass. That's lovely. The conclusion is aptly entitled The More Humane Letters. Vidas notes that he borrows this phrase to describe the rabbinic study of rabbinic teachings, the more humane letters, as opposed to their study of scripture, the divine letters. The rabbinic more humane letters is, quote, the close examination of text shaped by the achievements and individualities of those who created them. Vidas sees this Amoraic shift as a major rabbinic intellectual transformation, as well as a shift in what constitutes Torah and Jewish knowledge. Before engaging more directly with parts 1 and 2, I have 5 broad methodological observations. First, Vidas demonstrates that the close, painstaking study of such granular textual phenomena as identifying anonymous teachings, meanings and implications of Talmudic terms such as kedate and machlafa shitate, the significance of Amoraic emendations, or any of the other discrete textual phenomena in the book, all of these granular studies can yield a big idea about the Amoraic project overall. In fact, he is quite right that drawing large conclusions about the Amoraic project requires a very deep dive into the most granular levels of their literature. Second, he is also right that the study of these discrete textual phenomena requires the patient collection of many, many examples. Big ideas cannot be built on a foundation of 1 or 2 texts. 1 or 2 texts shows us something interesting. A few texts beyond that may indicate a tendency, but to establish a pattern that can yield a big idea, many more examples are needed. Third, Vidas rightly observes at various points throughout the book that while some earlier and contemporary scholars may have studied some of the same phenomena, these other scholars have not sufficiently appreciated how innovative and distinctive the Amoraic scholars actually were, or the extent to which the Amoraic scholars' interpretive project was a choice and not an inevitable one. Fourth, Vidas is also appropriately aware that demonstrating Amoraic innovation does not require that he argue for a complete rupture with the Tannaitic period. And he shows throughout the book that while Amoraic study practices are distinctive, there are indications of continuity. And my 5th methodological observation, although this book isn't about the Yerushalmi per se, the Yerushalmi does pose methodological challenges that every scholar must confront and about which every scholar must make decisions. Vidas rightly draws attention early in the book to the knotty methodological issue of whether the Yerushalmi is a reliable guide to the Amoraic scholars themselves or only to the perspectives of its compilers, and he argues sensibly for the former possibility. Given Vidas's interest in Amoraic study practices and not in the formation of the Yerushalmi, there was a loud but understandable silence in the book about, for example, such a perennial question about whether there was a Talmud of Caesarea, and there was an absence of analyses of the formations of sugyot, discrete Talmudic passages. Vidas also chooses not to attend to the distinctive characteristics of the different generations of Amoraic scholars, opting instead to focus on, quote, general characteristics of Amoraic scholarship as it is represented in the Yerushalmi. This approach has certainly yielded important findings, but I do suggest that further research into the distinctive Amoraic layers may be a desideratum. Vidas bases his methodological choice, at least in part, on Yaakov Zussman's observation that assigning Amoraim to discrete generations may be problematic. Leaving aside that problematic doesn't necessarily mean need not be attempted, Vidas himself notes an interesting intergenerational difference. The first Amoraic generation does not really engage in the distinctive Amoraic study practices analyzed in the book. Vidas also notes in chapter 6 on Ittanai Tani that some of the textual divergences under study may be scholarly fabrications or the results of scholarly exercises. To me, these compelling observations suggest the possibility of inter and maybe even intra-generational differences. Challenging as it may be in some cases to sort out the generations, it may be worthwhile at some later point to make the attempt and pursue the inquiry. And now to the substance of the book. Part 1 consists of 4 studies which, taken together, persuade me that there is indeed a distinctive Amoraic interpretive term. Identifying an anonymous tradition as the view of a particular Amoraic sage was seen as an intellectual end in its own right, with interpretive and not necessarily legal implications. Chapter 1. Linking traditions with the term kedate is more than mere linkage. It is meant to show, as you demonstrate, that the teaching reflects an Amoraic scholar's personal inclination. Chapter 2. The concern about an Amoraic sage's line being switched shows that there is a sense that the sage must have a distinctive line of teaching, that reading for such patterns in sages' teachings is productive. Chapter 3. And finally, the Amoraic sages engage extensively in pondering the importance and ethics of citation. Chapter 4. However, the question that nags at me is, why did the Amoraic sages take this turn? Part of the reason the question nags at me is that Vidas himself states at the beginning of the book that this research has high stakes. The Amoraic interpretive turn is a pivotal development in Jewish intellectual history. But Vidas does not really confront the why question head on. He is commendably minimalist in drawing broad historical conclusions from his data, although he points throughout the book to tantalizingly suggestive possible overlaps between the Amoraic scholars' interpretive approaches and elements of Christian and Greco-Roman textuality. Toward the end of the book, Vidas reiterates the need for further research into contemporaneous Greek and Latin textual scholarship. But tantalizing as these hints are, and as patient and willing as I am to await the results of further research, the book still leaves me with the question, why the 3rd and 4th centuries, and what was really at stake for the Amoraic scholars as they made this intellectual shift? Moving beyond possible intellectual overlaps with Greek and Latin literature, I would also ask, can anything else be found in the Amoraic literature of the land of Israel that might help explain this interpretive turn? What other developments, if any, do we see in the Amoraic scholars' overall portrayals of themselves, their religious ideas, or their social involvements that can illuminate or be illuminated by their innovative interpretive turn? And finally, looking beyond the text of the Yerushalmi, I ask, maybe a little bit unfairly, but I'll ask, if this innovation was so pivotal, and I agree that it likely was, can we get just a hint of what difference this innovation may have made for the interpretive methods and project of the Babylonian Amoraic scholars, at least the ones whose generations overlap with the Yerushalmi? And now I have a more focused question about possible overlaps with Christian textual scholarship. Vidas notes that Jerome was a contemporary of the Amoraic scholars and that Foucault even later identified Jerome as the originator of the notion of the author. To Vidas, Jerome was, as it were, more Amoraic in his approach to textuality than the Tannaitic Rufinus, who was more focused on content and less on the individuals who formulated the content. And now on to the tension between them. Jerome criticized Rufinus's translation into Latin of Origen's commentary on Romans. As Vidas portrays it, the Amoraic Jerome felt that the Tannaitic Rufinus improperly blended Origen the author, Didymus the commentator, and Rufinus the translator. Jerome criticized Rufinus for pushing the boundaries of translation and not allowing those different voices to speak to themselves. But it seems not to have occurred to either Jerome or Rufinus to treat Origen's text like scripture, as a text worthy of scholarly commentary. That's apparently just what the Amoraic scholars were doing, authoring commentaries on texts that were themselves also produced by human scholars. Even should there turn out to be demonstrable intellectual overlap between the Amoraic and Christian scholars, we must ask why the Amoraic scholars developed an apparently even more thoroughgoing interest in the individual human author than did Christian scholars in the 3rd and 4th centuries, such that even texts produced by humans were seen as deserving of scholarly commentary. Vidas also alludes at points in the book to possible intra-rabbinic tensions around this interpretive turn, and I suggest that further systematic study of these tensions might eventually yield a more complete picture of the Amoraic intellectual project. For example, he observes that since the new study practices give rabbinic texts a status previously reserved only for scripture, a story in which Rabbi Yochanan is tacitly compared to an idol suggests that the rabbinic sage's desire to be quoted now indicates an aspiration to godlike status, which the story problematizes by analogizing the sage with the idol. That's an interesting instance of possible pushback. Later in the same chapter, Vidas again observes that tensions may stem from what he calls the new practices of citation. It is unsurprising to me that the new Amoraic study practices would engender some tension or even opposition, given how human-centered and scholar-focused they are. The new study practices can do more than turn the Amoraic sage into an idol, as problematic as that is. By treating even the textual products of recent Amoraic scholars as sources worthy of study and commentary, the new study practices place greater distance than already existed in rabbinic culture between the Amoraic intellectual project and divine scripture, and between Amoraic learning and traditions inherited from Tannaitic or even earlier Amoraic scholars. I was struck by another small example of this tension, which Vidas doesn't represent as such, and great minds think alike. It was your example from Megillah 3:474a to b. Rav Hila, as you saw, offers an answer to a question based on a tradition, a shmuah, attributed to Rabbi Yochanan, while Rabbi Zeira offers an answer on his own. Rabbi Zeira stares at Rabbi Hila with disapproval, and the latter turns this right back on him. It is Rabbi Hila who should be staring at Rabbi Zeira disapprovingly, given that Rabbi Hila is citing a tradition and Rabbi Zeira is stating an opinion. As small as this example is, it epitomizes what could have been another tension, that between Amoraic proponents of tradition and Amoraic proponents of opinion. My last observation about tensions forms a bridge between parts 1 and 2. I also discern tension about the new Amoraic study practices in a set of texts about which I have published under the heading, The Motif of the Forgetting and Restoration of Law. Way too briefly, this refers to texts in the Yerushalmi that describe laws as having been forgotten and restored later to rabbinic awareness through the actions of scholars who enacted laws they may not even have realized had been forgotten. Their acts of legislation were therefore acts of restoration. Vidas mentions this topic in a few places and distinguishes the forgetting restoration phenomenon, which is focused on the substance of the laws themselves, from the new Amoraic study practices, which are focused on the contributions of discrete sages. I don't at all dispute the distinction. My point is that these texts, even as their tendence differs from that of the new Amoraic study practices, may indicate another avenue of opposition to the new practices. I've argued that the Yerushalmi's forgetting restoration motif demonstrates an Amoraic view that there is tacit divine oversight of the otherwise entirely human rabbinic legal process. This proposed Amoraic view may be a form of pushback against the new interpretive methods which focus on the intellectual production of individual sages. The Amoraic focus on studying and producing commentary on texts authored by rabbis pushes the rabbinic project even further away from divine grounding of rabbinic law than it may have been pushed in the Tannaitic period. While this may not have been at all troubling to some Amoraic scholars, it may indeed have been troubling to others who may have sought for a way to link the Amoraic intellectual project back in some way to the divine. But of even greater concern, and here's the link to part 2 of the book, the fragmentary and imperfect state of Amoraic learning itself may have been a source of anxiety to some Amoraic scholars. Another Talmudic term that highlights this fragmentation of Amoraic learning is one of my favorite questions from one sage to another. Adayan at lezu? Are you not yet at this? Do you still not yet know this? Thinking about the forgetting restoration motif, particularly in connection with chapter 5, which focuses on the fact that rabbinic knowledge is contingent on individual access and geography, one can imagine how the serendipity or knowledge destabilization attendant upon one Amoraic scholar's learning a tradition from another who just happens to show up from elsewhere could cast a shadow on the reliability of Amoraic learning overall. It's also reasonable to hypothesize that fragmentation is conducive to forgetting. The forgetting restoration motif may have helped some Amoraic scholars alleviate that anxiety and assure them of the fundamental reliability of Amoraic learning. Again, my overall point is that while Vidas realizes that the Amoraic innovations engendered some opposition, further research into the form such opposition may have taken may paint for us a more complete picture of the Amoraic project overall. In addition to a study of how knowledge is contingent on individual access and geography, part 2 studies textual divergencies, chapter 6, textual emendations, chapter 7, all great stuff. An Amoraic scholar's distinctively Amoraic approach to using text to illuminate other texts in chapter 8. Some of the key takeaways are: 1, Amoraic scholars embraced recitation divergencies and their significance. They saw textual divergencies as intellectually productive. 2, emending texts is an Amoraic innovation. It implies that a received text is incorrectly formulated. Amoraic scholars invoke multiple recitations when they construe them as equally valid. Their goal was to produce a precise, error-free recitation consistent with the law as the amending scholars perceive it. 3, Amoraic teachings are construed as fragments in the sense that they are lost. They circulate without context, or they became embedded in a misleading context. Amoraic texts don't just wander. Rather, Amoraic scholars recontextualize texts through their own analyses and in keeping with their own interpretive considerations and scholarly agenda. Part 2 studies of Amoraic production of and grappling with textual fragmentation lays suggestive groundwork for some productive thinking about the formulation of the Talmud Yerushalmi, notwithstanding that such an investigation is not part of the Rise of Talmud's agenda. The image of the Amoraic intellectual project the book leaves me with is one of intellectual vitality and confidence, multiplicity, fragmentation, and centrifugal energy. The Amoraic scholars greatly expand the rabbinic textual repertoire. They produce the texts which they then study and upon which they produce commentary. They take an active interest in individual scholars by seeking patterns in discrete scholars' perspectives. Their study practices both produce textual fragmentation and grapple with its consequences. Left unchecked, the textual empire building of the Amoraic scholars may have continued for longer than it did. It's idle to speculate why this process seems to have come to an end toward the end of the 4th century, but of course it did. For some reason, the Rise of Talmud suggests to me either the latest Amoraic scholars or some immediately post-Amoraic compilers chose to go centripetal. They moved from centrifugal to centripetal, and the result is the Yerushalmi. I'm tempted now to think that the Yerushalmi is a monument to a late 4th, early 5th century sense that the Amoraic textual universe had become too fragmented, too diffuse, that there was a need to collect and organize the textual fragments of the vibrant 3rd and 4th centuries and bring the geographically diffuse Amoraic rabbinic project together within one compilation. The rise of Talmud, then, may indeed have been a catalyst for the eventual rise of the Talmud. Thanks to Vidas's work, the Amoraic scholars of the 3rd and 4th centuries are indeed lip-syncing in the grave, the title of chapter 4. I close with the words Vidas chooses to close the book. As he puts it, the rabbinic study of rabbinic teachings, quote, presents us with the opportunity to encounter their humanity as well as our own. Thank you for gifting us with this thoroughly researched, clearly written, which is a very difficult task given the types of analyses in the book, and compelling new book. It is going to be an indispensable lens through which we should read and reread the early Amoraic intellectual project.
Yeah,
You're going to sit here and
Okay. With you.
for a moment unmute the.
so we're gonna turn to the Q&A in a minute, but first we will let Moulie chance to respond to this great response.
Should I wait, Magda, for you to tell me it's okay? Okay.
Now I think you don't have to see it.
I just want to mostly thank you for, well, I mean, on the one hand, close reading, of course, every author wants to be closely read and understood and seen, and I appreciate that. But even more so, the ideas of how to take this forward. I think, you know, both some of the more specific points. I love the idea that the restoration of Torah is in opposition to this thing. I didn't think about it. I think it works so well. And like I should have thought about it honestly, but that's why we have
It was
two people.
so interesting. I
Yeah.
understand what you did. You
Yeah.
brought it up because you needed to distinguish it from what they were doing.
Because it's actually didn't work, and now it doesn't work because actually it's an opinion that disagrees,
Yeah.
and I love that idea. I also love the idea that with which you concluded that the Talmud is actually in disagreement with Talmud, right? Like meaning that actually those are two different streams in intellectual thought. It actually helps thinking. One of the main questions I get about this book is like people tell me, well, if the Talmud is all about attribution, why is the Talmud anonymous, right? And I think that one of the way, because it tries to present, as you said, like something central and definitive in light of this other mess, right? So I really appreciate it. I think that the thing I was the lacuna that you pointed to that I was sure about, the one that almost meant that this book would take another 10, it took 10 years, that would take another 10 years, was this question of the formation of the Yerushalmi. And I'm actually curious also you've already given so much, but I'm curious to see if you have more thoughts on that, because you've worked on it. And I in part tried not to do that because I felt that would trap me in these older paradigms of, you know, the missing Talmud, the Talmud that is like less beautiful, all those things. But I think that I really take the suggestion, which I didn't think about, that the chapter 2 charts, the part 2 of the book charts the way maybe to do that. And so thank you for all of that. And there's more, I have more to say, but I want to open it to
Thank you. A supportive comment and 2 questions, if I may. You concluded your formal presentation noting how the Talmud preserves the plethora of voices and opinions, and actually Rashi, the great medieval commentator who lived from 1040, approximately 1040 to 1105 of the Common Era, he writes, his words are printed in Talmud Bavli, Tractate Ketubot 57a. The mnemonic for me is nose, Nun Zayin. And Rashi there explains that the preservation of the minority opinions, because, you know, for legal purposes, we follow the majority. They had the votes in the House of Study and the Academy, and that's what's normative practice. Why preserve the minority? Because, says Rashi, with Shinui Mu'at, with just a slight change in the facts of a future case, the minority opinion, the minority scholars may be able to sway members of the majority to rule accordingly. So it's important. My question is, you mentioned the emendations in the Hanaitic sources, and the Amoritic is viewed a little differently. What I understand, and have you come across this idea in academia, the idea of Hasure Machzora, which is to preserve the following principle. As we all know, the Talmud was never supposed to be written down. This is the oral law. And a way of keeping the necessity of having oral, I'll just say fillers, is to have the need for the emendation. Have you come across that idea in your, and I asked this to both, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the 2 parts of your comment actually are connected, right? Because the emendations we see, emendations by definition, if we know about them, present also the defective text, right? And this question is like, why do that? Why not just amend? Especially actually, if what you say is right, but many people think so, that the Talmud as we have it is a record of some sort of oral performance. That means that they had to first present the wrong version and then present the emendation. We have one really fascinating story that I love and quote and analyze in chapter 7, which is the story is about Hananiah ben Shilmaya, who is a relatively junior scholar, okay? And he has this terrifying job, which is to teach the Mishnah to the son of Rav, who is like, you know, the biggest deal in the Talmud, right? And he teaches the Mishnah. This is the Mishnah in Eruvin, and this happens outside. They used to have apparently the lessons, like it's private lessons outside the scholar's home, right? And he teaches the Mishnah in Eruvin, and Rav, the Talmud says, Rav popped his head out the window, and he said, "It's not here," right? like meaning you can't recite it that way, right? And Hananiah ben Shammai, who I assume if this actually happened, is like sweating all over at this point, and he's like, wait, so you want me to tell your son that this clause is not here? And he says, no, recite it, but tell him also that it's not here, right? And so the way I think of it is, in modern edition, what we do is like we have an asterisk or like, a scholarly apparatus. And this enables this technology of preserving the wrong text alongside the right thing, allows us to do a lot of things, right? One thing that it allows us to do is to mark a text in between. Like, we're not saying maybe it's wrong, right? But the argument could be made, right? And we allow a debate about it and disagreement about that. We also mark our own scholarly brilliance by, by showing, okay, there was a wrong text, and yet I amended it. We also allow to, and this is connected to what you said with Rashi, because they use some of the same ideas about amending text that they use with keeping the less legal opinion, because what if another person then accepts it, right? So in that way, right, this technology of emendations that we see in the Talmud enable the whole range of sort of conceptual innovations.
Thank you. My second question, if I may, a brief one. You began your presentation speaking of how Talmud Lomar is I'm using the Hebrew, and you can explain it in your answer. It seems to be is it specific to Tanaim, or we find that in the Amaritic discussion too. And Talmud Lomar, that Talmud is used to for interpreting texts. Any sort
Scripture in that case, yeah.
I'm sorry?
Scripture in that case.
Scripture, right.
Yeah, so that is one of the indications we have. The Talmud is not actually restricted to rabbinic teachings, certainly not in the Tannaitic period, right? And I don't think even for most of the Talmudic period itself, the Amoraic period, it comes to mean commentary on rabbinic teachings in the early medieval world. The question of what exactly it means in the Tannaitic words, or in the Tannaitic sense, or even in the Talmud itself, is kind of vexed because the uses are not precise enough, right? Often it appears, when the word appears, it's often in lists, these kind of like lists of so-and-so studied everything. They studied Mishnah and Tosefta and Talmud and that, but like it doesn't tell us what each of these things are. I think if I don't know if Professor Gray would agree or disagree, but I think it means something like advanced study, and therefore Talmud Lomar is something like, you have an issue, but our research, our kind of advanced study, the verse as we have studied it in our advanced interpretive way means something else, right? That is, so the function of Talmud Lomar is usually to introduce the solution, right, to a problem, right? And Talmud also appears as the highest often in like the list of disciplines. But I honestly think that this is a bigger problem that requires, it's one of the things that my long list of homework today of things I still need to do. So yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, where did these original discussions take place? Like, talking about the holy books or the Talmud, where did they happen?
Where or when?
Well, I think more where than when.
You mean like what kind of the Zitzim live in, the place in the world that they actually occur?
It wasn't at this university.
It wasn't in this university, no. It would surprise. Maybe. What is time? But this is in the Yerushalmi, we think, was compiled in Tiberias and mostly represents the opinions and of Tiberian scholars. We know that because the Talmud would often use words like here and there, and here the implication is very often Tiberias, right? Here we say this. There can be a number of places. It can be Babylonia, where there's a rival and growing and soon to be subverting the center in Tiberias, right? Center of Torah. But it could also be the other centers of in the land of Israel and Palestine. So Professor Gray mentioned Caesarea as one of those centers. And but part of what's interesting about the genre Talmud is that it brings all these locations together, and it does so in a way that doesn't mix them. It maintains geography is important. And I don't think it's a coincidence, therefore, that we have the two Talmuds that we have are differentiated geographically. The Talmud of the land of Israel, or the Palestinian Talmud in English, right? And the Talmud of Babylonia. it's the sense is that somehow place is crucial to how you study Torah because of it's a different community of people, it's a different set of challenges, it's a different tradition. Do you have more?
No,
You're as a Talmud in exile. Yeah.
I would say the location is definitely very important. I was thinking a couple of things while you were talking. One is the location was definitely important. And if I could just roll something into the middle of the room that I'm going to roll away from when we all leave here, it's one of the reasons that I have been open to the possibility over the years that writing played a role. Because when you're taking this material from the land of Israel, and you're not just going from Tiberias to the Darom, to the south, you're going somewhere else. Just from what I read of orality studies, it just sort of problematized the idea that that was, shall we say, unproblematic. So all that, just to say, I agree that the location and the point that you make, which is really interesting, and it's true, it's bringing that material together. In the Yerushalmi in particular, it's not systematically thinking through it. And just one example, because it's something I've been looking at again recently, in chapter 3 of Tractate Sukkah, issues around the stolen lulav. Is the stolen lulav disqualified for use on the holiday of Sukkot because it's stolen? Its stolenness is like an inherent flaw that renders it incapable of being used? Or is it merely a matter of ownership and that given the right sort of set of circumstances, the stolen lulav can be used? The literature of Erez Yisrael has both ideas, keeps them apart, never brings them together. Where does it come together? The Bavli. The Bavli is another way of looking. So again, you have sort of these distinctive, one isn't better than the other. There are different ways in the different places of looking at what learning is. One, just bring it together. The other one, I'm going to bring it together and I'm going to try to harmonize it and systematize it and think through it.
Jessica.
Thank you. This is super interesting. I was wondering how you connect these sort of very developed senses of characterization that you see in the Amoraic texts with the form of characterization that does exist in Tannaitic. So I'm thinking especially of characters like Rabban Gamliel and the way he's sort of portrayed very sort of as having a very particular character, for example, in Mifneh Rosh Hashanah, where you have stories about the calendar, and how that sort of more limited form of characterization connects or doesn't connect to what the Amoraim are doing.
Yeah, I think so. I think the characterization we see in the Tannaitic period that you refer to is in narrative. It's in stories. It's not necessarily it doesn't figure necessarily in the way that they coordinate or comment on the teachings of these sages. But the way that it does connect is, I think that then one of the way the characterization works in the Talmud is by bringing stories and law together. So, for example, the story of Rabbi Jonah, which we saw, right? It's a story that is associated with the teaching to illuminate, right? So in that way, you have and it works in such ways several times, right? So in that way, the characterization that does exist comes to bear on the new forms of interpretation. Thank you.
You kind of referenced this earlier, so maybe I'll give you a chance to elaborate on it. But how much did the groups, the Tanaim and the Amoraim, understand themselves as distinct in their own moment from each other? And if they did imagine at least some form of distinction, how did they imagine their respective ability? Well, I guess only the Amoraim would do this to the Tanaim, but how did they imagine their respective abilities relative to them? Did they see their need to reference them as a sign of their own relative distance from scripture and this need to kind of use them as an intermediary? And then the last part, if these groups didn't see themselves as entirely distinct, or maybe the first generation of Amoraim you mentioned had a kind of didn't share some of the interpretive characteristics, how can we still work with these groups as kind of necessary intellectual groupings without reifying them in ways that we end up kind of slipping into imagining, Fordham University and NYU as kind of the modern examples of very distinct institutions?
This is like an extremely central set of questions that you are raising, and one on which astonishingly the Talmud tells us very, very little, if not at all. And I'll say like, so first, even the terms. I don't think the terms Tanaim and Amoraim, which their Aramaic equivalents appear in the Yerushalmi. I don't think they mean these two groups that we now call Tanaim and Amoraim. I think they mean something else. And I've written about one of them. I published about Tanai. I'm going to publish about Amora. I don't think that they mean that. So already the question is even, you might think, well, even worse, right? So like even these two. So on the other hand, in the document as we have it, it's pretty clear that a source that is marked as what we call Tanaitic now with a root T and Y, a source like that, in general terms, starting with the second generation of what we call Amoraim, cannot be contradicted, right? So generally speaking, there are exceptions, right? But generally speaking, not only that, you also can't change it, right? So you can use it to support your argument. So if you're Rabbi Yochanan and you quote, or Rabbi Zeira or any of those people basically after Rabbi Yochanan on, right? If you quote a Tanaitic source, a source that is marked with this Tanai thing, it has an authority, and you can argue about what it means, but you can't contradict it unless you have another Tanaitic source that supports it. Now you might say, how do I know that these Tanaitic sources are at all connected with what we call Tanaim? The fact is that in terms of the sages which are mentioned in these sources, so a source that will be introduced with the verbs Tanai, it's been recited, all those matni, all those things, a source that is introduced with that series of verbs and terms will only mention sages that lived up to the period of the Mishnah, right? So this is what we're left with, meaning we're left with, it's clear that they see a distinction between those sages and themselves, right? The boundary might be a little different, right? It might not have been what we call the Amoraic period, right? So like Rabbi Chia, I don't know, right? But from afterwards, it seems pretty clear, at least according to the text that we have. You might argue, okay, it's a later standardization, but then you're kind of left with so on the one hand, you have this idea that they are clearly different and there's a difference in authority. On the other hand, it's never theorized explicitly in the Yerushalmi, to the best of my knowledge. It doesn't have its own, other than that terminological thing that I just mentioned, they don't say like things like an Amora may never contradict the Tanah, even though that seems to be so really, really interesting. It's really interesting to examine this. I will say, on the other hand, that just to cap this is, of course, saying that I can't contradict something doesn't actually mean I have less authority if I become the arbiter of the meaning of that text, right? And we know that, of course, the most famous example of that is the rabbis in the Bible, right? Yes, a rabbi does not explicitly contradict the Bible, but it is evidently clear from rabbinic literature that they did allow themselves to have it say whatever they wanted it to say. You want to say on that too? All right.